My war plunged downhill along with the nation's. On April 17th, I received notice that our boat had suffered almost irreparable damages. The bow tubes had been knocked out of alignment by the blow, and they had to be realigned. This long and difficult procedure would delay our next mission considerably. To make matters worse, the dry dock would not be available for some time. I became increasingly irritated. With sudden and terrifying clarity, I now saw that the war was lost. I accepted what I saw, and I pictured all of us ending up in an immense prison camp at the mercy of our merciless enemies. We would be reviled and brutalized, and there would be no way out except death by starvation. Yet there was one way out of the horror that would engulf us, one way to escape intolerable humiliation. Down at the waterfront lay my boat. When she was fully equipped, I could sail her to South America, to Uruguay or Argentina perhaps. Absconding with the boat seemed suddenly the only means to survive the catastrophe. How lucky I was that I had been able to preserve her for a final task. Instantly I put the wild impulse into practical planning. I sent Henniker to secure the necessary charts without telling him of my intentions. For days on end, I stayed in my room, poring over the maps and plotting escape routes. I reckoned and calculated my chances for reaching the Rio de la Plata. I planned on reducing the crew to a skeleton, taking only reliable, loyal, unmarried men, thus reducing the risk of being betrayed. I knew that I could count on most of my men, but was wary of including my officers. The chief had been transferred, and a new one not acquainted with the crew would be a heavy burden. The same applied to the exec and the ensign, both too young to grasp the situation. In my mind, I selected the few key men whom I would first draw into my conspiracy. No more than a few, for I was playing a dangerous game. I would not only be flouting naval authority, but also a strong group of diehards who advocated turning Norway into a fortress and starting a war of their own to achieve some obscure victory. In the meantime, German resistance fell apart in Italy, Austria, and inside Germany. Now only a madman could speak of recovery. But German oaths and patriotism and discipline were so deeply rooted that many a sane man threw his life into the fires of a lost cause. Among them were the captains and crews of our boats at sea. U-boats were sunk at the rate of 2 and 3 a day as they sailed from Bergen, Kristiansand, and Kiel on their first and final mission. Hundreds of good men died futilely to honour their pledge to duty and country. On April 27th, U-953 still lay at the pier, and it seemed that she would never be repaired in time for me to execute my plan. Then I was taken by surprise by an order to report to Senior Officer West in Bergen. Puzzled by the urgent call, I prepared myself for a long train ride through half of Norway. Because I owned nothing but U-boat fatigues which were unsuitable for the trip, I requisitioned a ski outfit from the supply laid in for those who had taken their leaves in the Norwegian mountains during better days. Dressed in blue ski pants and a light grey anorak, with food for 4 days in a knapsack, I departed from Trondheim and began the journey through the snow-covered mountains. Late in the afternoon of April 30th, the train pulled into Bergen station. I managed to find the compound by memory. Someone led me to a room. I felt like a stranger in a hotel. Tuesday, May 1st. At 8:30, I knocked at the door of the senior officer's sanctuary. "I beg to report as requested, sir." "You were expected yesterday," was Kapitein Rosing's dry reply. "Sir, I made it as fast as I could." "Never mind. Your boat will not be ready in time for the great offensive. We need every experienced man on the front, and you are going to take command of another boat which is ready for patrol. The boat is about to arrive in Kristiansand from a German port." "Yes, sir. You are going to sail against England with vigour and determination. Admiral Dönitz has ordered all conventional U-boats to leave Germany for Norway, and we will continue our war at sea from here. We shall never surrender. We'll hold out, and our U-boats will force our terms upon the enemy." He handed me an order to report to the 27th U-boat flotilla, then continued, It occurs to me that you might as well act as a courier. I give you some top-secret papers which I want you to deliver to our bases in Oslo, Horten and Kristiansand. I expect to have them ready this afternoon." I was too stunned to make any reply. There was no limit to insanity. I clicked my heels, turned and left the room. Once outside, I gritted my teeth because my marvellous plan to escape was suddenly put beyond execution. But then it dawned on me that a new boat, already equipped for patrol, would give me an even better and quicker chance to reach South America. My determination to flee was strengthened by headquarters' irrational decision to force the battle at sea until the last man in the U-boat force would lie on the bottom. The effects of Dönitz's order were immediately apparent. In the compound and along the waterfront, last-minute preparations were made to send still more old-type U-boats to their deaths. Mechanics and dockhands laboured violently, hectically, as if the Reich's existence depended upon their efforts alone. Meanwhile, bewildering news spread throughout the compound. The latest armed forces communiqué had revealed that the battle for Berlin was nearing its climax. Hitler himself had taken command of the troops defending the capital. At 1900 I received the secret papers for which I had been waiting. By that hour it was too late to depart, so I had a meagre dinner in the officers' mess hall and left to get a good night's sleep for my trip to Kristiansand harbour. I tuned in the radio and waited for news stretched out on my bed. The music stopped. The announcer's voice, first stuttering, then loud and harsh, broke the brief silence. "Attention, I have an important announcement to make." Instantly I was wide awake. I looked at my watch. It was exactly 21:30. The music was a slow-moving passage from a Wagner opera, heralding a grave disclosure. I guessed that Berlin had fallen into Soviet hands, or even that a ceasefire had halted the senseless massacre. Then the announcer spoke again, low and solemn. "Our Führer, Adolf Hitler, fighting to his last breath, fell for Germany in his headquarters in the Reich's Chancellery. On April the 30th, the Führer appointed Grand Admiral Dönitz to take his place. The Grand Admiral and successor to the Führer now speaks to the German people." This was the end of the torture, the end of the war and of German history. The one impossible disaster was an accomplished fact. Hitler's death could only mean final recognition of defeat. Vaguely, I heard Dönitz's voice far in the background. He was saying that the military struggle had to go on to save the lives of millions of refugees, that we must continue to fight and defend our rights. His statement was drowned in the tunes of the national anthem. An immense sadness overpowered me. Along with tens of millions of Germans, I had given everything I had owned, loved and cherished. I had sacrificed home and family for the sake of my country and victory, and had blindly believed in the cause, and had fought and hoped and suffered and waited for the miracle in deep devotion. Now it was all over, simply over. The end. Heartsick, I struggled to the mess hall. There sat the commanding officer and a few others, pale, grief-stricken, confused. One said, "He died on the barricades, we have to go on." Someone else declared, "He gave us an example. We must hold out and continue here in Norway. The Allies will have a hell of a time smoking us out of the mountains." Others, voicing their opinion cautiously, suggested that this was indeed the end. Hopelessness soon silenced the exchange. We dispersed. The next morning, May 2nd, I took the express to Oslo and arrived late in the evening. On May 3rd, I delivered one envelope of secret papers to the given address, then boarded a train to Horten. In Horten, I handed over a second envelope to the adjutant of the naval base and continued by rail on the final leg of my last assignment. On May 4th, after a sleepless night on a wooden bench in an unheeled compartment, I arrived in Kristiansand around 0700. A blue sky spanned the city. I hiked down a narrow, dusty road that led to the compound, strolled through pines and crippled firs into the extensive complex, and entered the executive offices of the flotilla at 8:30. A youthful adjutant showed me into the commanding officer's elaborate room. Before me rose a decorated officer in blues, who had been a U-boat commander when hunting and shooting had been a pleasure. Kaptein Jürgensen was one of the lucky few who had been withdrawn from the front just in time to escape the Holocaust. "I beg to report for duty, sir," I saluted. "Oh yes, naturally, I've been informed of your arrival." "You are supposed to take a new command. Your boat hasn't arrived yet. I assume she'll sail into port any time. Why don't you accommodate yourself in the meantime? Let you know. That's all for now." This short, cool reception gave me a strange premonition. Something was odd about Jürgensen's behaviour, something that went beyond the strain that had signed his face. He seemed to be absent-minded and flustered. I walked out of his office convinced that he knew of some calamity that he had been unwilling to divulge. I hurried down to the waterfront. 2 old-type U-boats lay alongside the pier. Poking up beyond them was the strangely formed conning tower of a smaller boat of the new class. As I approached to examine the new weapon, I spotted her captain's white cap, then his face, above the rim of the bridge. "Angerman, is it really you?" I shouted across the water. "Hello, I see you're still alive," he called back. "Hi, weeds grow apace." "Is one of these old jalopies yours?" He pointed toward an old diving tube. "No, I am waiting to take command of another one still to arrive. I don't want to discourage you, but out there is hell, and she may never get here. We have just crossed the Skagerrak, and I know. Aircraft all over. The sky is black with them, and the devil is loose in Germany. Berlin is taken by the Soviets. The Americans have met them at the Elbe, and we escaped Kiel under direct fire from land." He wiped the sweat off his face and continued. "The Tommies have captured Kiel. The first tanks reached the Tirpitz Pier when I was in the middle of the bay, and they began firing their big cannon. And God, it's a miracle that we made it here. We lost at least 7 boats in the crossing, and I stopped counting this morning. I tell you, it can't last much longer." Angerman was reciting still more horrors when another small new boat ploughed up to the pier. A man threw a line. At that moment I recognized another face below the captain's white cap. My good friend Fred Schreiber had also escaped the massacre in the Baltic. Fred raised his right hand in salute. His flashing eyes had lost their vividness. His skin was ashen. I knew that disaster had struck. As soon as the gangplank was laid down, I rushed aboard to greet him. We pressed our hands in silence. He pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket and handed it to me, and his eyes grew moist. I unfolded the sheet. It was a deciphered signal from headquarters. "All U-boats. Attention, all U-boats. Ceasefire at once. Stop all hostile action against Allied shipping. Donuts." As I stared at the message, its letters blurred. I heard Fred saying, "We received it a half-hour ago. It's the finale." I felt a sudden pain welling up in my heart. I turned around and fought back my tears, for I had never been taught to lose. As of May 5, 1945, hostilities came to a halt. Dönitz, the head of the new government, had agreed to a preliminary surrender to the British armies, involving all of our armed forces in the northern region of the continent. The next day, every seaman on base was electrified by another radiogram from Dönitz. The admiral who had led the U-boats to glory and to disaster mourned for the faithful who lay on the bottom and gave thanks to those few survivors of the monstrous battle. "My U-boat men, 6 years of war, lie behind you. You have fought like lions. An overwhelming material superiority has driven us into a tight corner from which it is no longer possible to continue the war. Unbeaten and unblemished, you lay down your arms after a heroic fight without parallel. We proudly remember our fallen comrades who gave their lives for Führer and fatherland. Comrades, preserve that spirit in which you have fought so long and so gallantly for the sake of the future of the fatherland. Long live Germany." This was the message that put an end to the suffering. It admitted defeat for the first time. The murdering had finally come to an end. Henceforth we would be able to live without fear that we had to die tomorrow. An unknown tranquility took possession of me as I realized fully that I had survived. My death in an iron coffin, a verdict of long standing, was finally suspended. The truth was so beautiful that it seemed to be a dream. Nominally, the war ended on May 5, 1945, but I had to fight for almost 6 months more before I won my battle for survival. At first, Germany's surrender left me feeling deceived and betrayed. I concluded that it relieved me of my sworn obligations to folk and fatherland and military discipline. Since everything I held dear was dead, my only concern was to be free. But between me and freedom lay the vast, creaking apparatus of the Allied occupation. I assumed, quite correctly, that all who had fought for Germany faced a slow, painful, humiliating process of internment and interrogation and grudging repatriation, and I refused to subject myself to the whim and convenience of Allied military officials who were at best bewildered by their enormous task, and at worst vindictive and cruel. I was determined to flee and to find my own peace. I vowed that nothing would stop me from doing precisely as I pleased. In the days after Germany's capitulation, I found no cause for confidence in the victors. The British went on attacking those last U-boats which fled German ports for Norway, and I thought that they were merely continuing their policy of extermination. I spent most of my time at the waterfront with my old friend Fred Schreiber, watching as a few other captains dashed into Kristiansand in their battered, shell-punctured U-boats. Eckel of U-2325 and Wex of U-2354 told us that 5 of their companion boats had been sunk while crossing the Danish Sea and the Skagerrak. This brought our U-boat casualties since war's end to 16, and to 779 the grand total of U-boats sunk since the start of the war. May 7th was a day when hysteria reigned supreme all around us. The Norwegians wildly celebrated their liberation. 3 of our seamen, who were found drunk in the company of Norwegians, were put in chains by Jørgensen, the commanding officer, who grimly planned a court-martial as a warning. And last but not least, the British came ashore in Kristiansand, stirring speculation about an imminent seizure of our compound. Against this hectic backdrop, I persuaded my good friend Fred Schreiber to escape with me to South America. Reluctantly, he fell in with my plan. We would abscond with his small boat and men, schnorkel all the way to Trondheim, where my larger J7955 lay waiting, then sail her with a select crew to Argentina. That night, just as we were about to put our plan into effect, everyone on base was ordered to report to the repair shop for a show being staged by Kapitan Jørgensen and his aides. Fred and I recoiled in horror when we entered the dimly lighted square where the U-boat crews had formed a human horseshoe facing the white-walled shop. There, suspended from a makeshift scaffold, hung 3 nooses. Below stood a large table, with 3 high stools lined up on top. In front of the gallows was a crude bench covered with a huge Navy war flag. A ship's lantern, placed on the red cloth, cast an eerie light on a Navy sabre and a copy of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. A band of armed Marines took up position behind the stage. Staff officers rushed back and forth. Lieutenant Lange, Jørgensen's young adjutant, shouted frantic orders. As the crowd stirred uneasily, Jørgensen began speaking. "Soldiers, I have called you together to demonstrate how we will avoid another 1918. I am going to make an example of these 3 deserters, an example that will strike fear into the hearts of any men with revolutionary tendencies. We will protect and nourish those ideals instilled in us by our martyred Führer. Guards, bring these men to justice." What followed was a perfect nightmare come to life. The captives, their hands tied behind their back, were led into the square. Momentarily they were paralyzed by the sight of the nooses. Then they broke away and fled. Lange shot one man repeatedly in the back. As the fugitive fell on his face, the 2 others surrendered. Then all 3 were brutally dragged back to the scaffold. Lange shouted a long list of trumped-up charges. He then demanded the severest punishment, death by hanging. No one in the crowd dared to protest in the face of the many rifles. Jurgensen pronounced the 3 men guilty on all counts and condemned them to be hanged by the neck until death has separated body from soul. The guards were then ordered to execute the sentence, but before the 3 doomed men reached the platform, they broke free again and began fighting desperately for their lives. Shots were fired. There was struggling, trampling. Dust rose in the lantern's gloomy light. The 3 were recaptured, but with superhuman force they broke free once again. They fought, bit, kicked, and punched until they were surrounded and again overwhelmed. Now Jurgensen cried, "Shoot these men dead! Don't hang them! Shoot them!" The Marines heard the call, and all went very fast. One man raised his rifle and fired point blank. The mate's face flew off like a pancake. The 2 other prisoners collapsed and were riddled with bullets. The Marines dragged the 3 bodies against the wall of the repair shop and left them there. The crews were dismissed. The guards marched away. Everyone vanished. Long after midnight, 2 petty officers helped me lift the bodies into a rowboat. We fastened heavy weights to their feet and neck, then rowed out into the middle of the fjord. 3 splashes, and the dead seaman had at least received a sailor's burial. The execution completely reversed Fred's decision to sail that night, or any other night. For the next few days, the compound remained in the grip of a deathly calm. Most of the men were stunned and guilt-sickened by the organised murder. The deed drained off my last lingering hopes. When Germans killed Germans without a qualm, there could be no future for me in my homeland, no mercy at the hands of the conquerors. To my surprise, however, the British ignored our U-boats at the base and did nothing to harm other boats which complied with their order to put into the nearest English port flying a black flag from the extended periscope. And my fears were further allayed by my first contact with a British officer. It was midday when I was sent to see the British district commander in a small town east of Kristiansand. My mission was to arrange the evacuation of all naval personnel from the U-boat base. I made the trip by armoured car with 2 seamen holding submachine guns at the ready, for we had been warned against an ambush by vengeful members of the Norwegian underground. I found the English commander, one Colonel MacGregor, dressing belatedly in his room in the village hotel. MacGregor closed the door behind me and offered me a chair. "I've just taken my morning exercises," he said apologetically in an interesting Scottish brogue. "Running helps me to keep trim, you see. A man of my age must watch his weight." Then MacGregor poured me a glass of wine. "It's the best I could find in this damned town." And as he continued dressing, MacGregor told me a little about himself. He had parachuted into the mountains 3 months ago and had organised the Norwegian resistance. He then explained that his orders called for all German troops to leave Kristiansand within 3 days and go to the nearby island of Tromøy. I was completely disarmed by MacGregor's informality, and I decided that it was neither disgraceful nor dangerous to cooperate with such an officer. In the heat of a May afternoon, thousands of Navy men poured over the bridge into the well-kept garrison of Tromøy, which had been a German coast artillery base for years. Our enlisted men were billeted in barracks. Fred and I joined a group of officers and took over a neat farmhouse that had served as a club. The total absence of British troops and our unharried settlement into domesticated groups led us to think that our stay on Tromøy would be brief and quite tolerable. It proved to be neither. Despite our strict, self-imposed routine, which included many organised activities and an early curfew, the hours dragged and the days inched by. The compound was agog with rumours and wild speculation about our future and that of our homeland. Our insecurity and resentment grew as the days became weeks, and still no word from the British. Some men were unable to maintain their equilibrium under the subtle pressures of our defeat and confinement. One officer hanged himself from a rafter in the attic, and we buried him between the red rocks of Tromøy. 3 weeks after our arrival, a riot broke out in a barracks occupied by enlisted men who claimed to be non-Germans pressed into service. They barricaded themselves in their quarters and shot an officer who came to investigate. The mutiny was not put down until the commotion attracted British troops from the mainland. 2 nights later, the English returned for reprisals. We were awakened from a sound sleep, herded at bayonet point into a meadow, and ordered to strip. We marched forth and back between 2 rows of Tommies while their comrades ransacked our quarters searching for hidden weapons. Our nudity was a calculated indignity. It erased the distinction between officers and men, and informed us all that our subjugation was complete. The Tommies found little that interested them, and after shooting up our quarters in disappointment, they departed as suddenly as they had arrived. In early July they came again, this time to set up a board of inquiry under the sky. We were informed that we had to register to get our discharge papers. Elated by our renewed prospects for prompt repatriation, I gladly gave a Britisher all the information he wanted. When he asked about my hometown, I named Frankfurt as a likely place to start over again, though I now had no connection with the city except sad memories and a bank account of worthless currency. But the Tommies departed, and our hopes were soured by 2 more weeks of interminable waiting. The break finally came on July 24th. A small detachment of British troops arrived and collected those of us who had elected to be discharged in the American and the French occupation zones. We were marched down to barges waiting in the fjord, then ferried to the small port of Mandal. There we were surrounded by mixed British-Norwegian troops who displayed an alarmingly martial look. That night we slept in a field in British tents, with our bellies filled for the first time in weeks with Irish stew. In the morning we went through a long ordeal of search and interrogation. To put us at a disadvantage and make deceit more difficult, the Tommies again ordered us to strip, then took us for questioning in a nearby barn. My inquisitor was a British officer about 15 years my senior. For the first time I was asked, and I honestly answered, questions that would be put to me often in the years to come. What was your last position in the Navy? U-boat commander. I thought we had all of you chaps eliminated. How many Allied ships have you sunk? I don't know. Come now, didn't you report your sinkings? Of course I did, but I had no interest in keeping count. Does that mean you hope to disown responsibility for what you've done? Sir, I did my duty. I stand on it. Well, let's not argue that point. But we have cleaned up your ranks pretty well, haven't we? There may be 24 captains still alive. Besides me, 2 or 3 of them may have fought through most of the war. Have you been a member of the Nazi Party? No. Have you been a member of the Hitler Youth? No. Have you ever been a member of any of the party's organizations? No. Nonsense. That's what all you Germans say. You had to belong to at least one of the organizations. How else could you have become an officer in the Navy, especially a U-boat captain? Come on, at least admit that you were a member of the Hitler Youth. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you are misinformed. The Navy did not recruit officers from the Hitler Youth, and membership in the party was not a prerequisite for joining the Navy. We had only to meet the same sort of qualifications your Navy asks. I've heard otherwise. I must warn you to tell the truth. Any false statement will incur a heavy penalty. You had better admit your membership now and save yourself a lot of trouble. We've captured all the party's records, and it is easy for us to find the truth. These are the facts. I have nothing to add. The Inquisitor broke off his questioning and consulted a heavy volume, the Allies' wanted list. Finding nothing, he asked me how I had managed to survive, and seemed startled by some accounts I gave him of my narrow escapes. Finally, he stamped my discharge papers and handed them to me with a bleak smile. Take good care of these. Without them, you're liable to end up behind barbed wire. And, Captain, good luck. Late that afternoon, I was at the rail of a grimy old freighter when she sailed for Germany. Several thousand discharged servicemen crowded the deck and watched the Norwegian shore fade away. There was no laughter, no rejoicing, just silence. We were all back on deck the next morning, July 26th, when our vessel entered the wide delta of the Weser River and was shunted by 2 tugboats to a quay in Bremerhaven harbour. We were silent too as we set foot again on German soil. At once, American troops took us under their command and collected our discharge papers. We were loaded on trucks, transported to a camp on the outskirts of Bremerhaven, fumigated and fed. Fred and I shared a small tin of sardines and a few biscuits of our own. Then we rolled up in blankets and fell asleep under the stars. At dawn on July 27th, about 3,000 of us were herded onto a freight train bound for Frankfurt, where we were to be released. It was a long, slow, dismal trip. We passed wheat fields ready for the harvest, countryside stations and crossroads guarded by American soldiers, highways clogged with Allied armoured columns, and mountains of rubble that once had been beautiful cities. We reached Frankfurt late the second afternoon of our journey, and as the train snaked through the suburbs and then along the Schaumenkai at the main river, I bitterly accepted the fact that my hometown, destroyed beyond recognition, had become an American garrison. The train stopped on the quay amidst the once flowering Nizza Park. I asked our guards what the problem was, and was told that we would have to stay in the open cattle cars until we had reached Höchst, a city west of Frankfurt. The train finally pulled out of Frankfurt. We rolled to Höchst, then through it and further westward, on and on, without another stop. I felt that the Americans had double-crossed us and thought of leaping off the train. But before I could act, the train stopped at sunset in the valley of the Rhine. A few rifle shots, an enormous commotion, and our caravan was surrounded by French troops. Someone speaking fluent German in a French accent announced over a loudspeaker, "Keep your heads down. This is the French army, and we will shoot at any sign of disobedience. Remain calm and follow orders." Total consternation. I knew now that freedom was but a dream, that the reality would be imprisonment behind barbed wire. We cursed and complained that our transfer to the French was illegal. But there was no one to hear our accusations, our anguish. That night no one slept. We sat in the boxcars under a battery of truck headlights and threatening gun muzzles. The wolves had been entrusted with the care of the flock. At 500 on July 29th, we were awakened by a recording of the Marseillaise, followed by a candid Alsatian voice saying, "Leave the cars at once, form ranks at the riverside, make no attempt to escape, it would prove fatal." Some 3,000 Germans dismounted and lined up as ordered. We were marched onto a swaying pontoon bridge across the Rhine and into the French occupation zone. Soon we were treated to an ironic spectacle. As the sun rose, its rays glinted on the huge Victory Monument atop the Niederwald mountain. Now the Rhine barred our way back to the relative security of the British zone, and hundreds of us would never return. We continued our march through the morning heat, driven ahead by a shouting, gesticulating detachment of French troops. By noon we were dehydrated and fatigued as we dragged ourselves into the notorious Camp Dietersheim, a maximum security camp for prisoners of war. As we walked beneath the ornamented arch into confinement, a horse-drawn wagon rumbled by, loaded with nude, emaciated corpses. Flashing bayonets separated officers from enlisted men and forced us into a huge cage already crowded with German prisoners. Our countrymen were walking skeletons, half naked and filthy. Their hair and beards were long and snarled, their skin leathery brown and ruptured by malnutrition. For months they had lived in the open and slept exposed to the elements in holes in the ground. Every rain would turn this barren land into a sea of mud and bury men in graves they had dug with their own hands. Fred and I selected a vacant hole, buried our few belongings in the dust. As we awaited further developments, playful Moroccan soldiers continually set off hand grenades and fired rifles for their own amusement. Shortly after noon, a cart arrived with aluminum cans containing our first formal meal since the Irish stew back in Norway. It was supposed to be soup, but it looked and tasted like greasy dishwater. I told Fred that I was not going to sit around wasting away into another skeleton. I would find an escape route that very night. When night had fallen over the camp, I began a nerve-wracking trial run for my first escape. I cautiously crawled into the alleyway between our cage and the adjoining one, then snaked along the dusty ground toward the perimeter fences at a spot halfway between two guard towers. I moved slowly across the floodlit open stretch in full view of the lofty machine gunners. Then I wriggled along the inner fence until I reached a dimly lit zone. Now only a barbed wire roll and another fence lay between me and freedom. Not far outside, a thicket of high ferns promised safety, if only I could reach it. Deciding that this was the way I would make my break the following night, I slowly retraced my wriggling path. By the time I had returned to my hole, most of the night was gone. The blaring strains of the Marseillaise wrenched me out of my sleep. Immediately I told Fred of my escape route. To my disappointment, Fred was not enthusiastic. He suggested that my chances would be better if I tried alone. If I succeeded, he would follow and meet me again at an address in Frankfurt. I started crawling again that night at 21:30. It was a long, heart-pounding trip. With utmost caution, I crept into the shadow of a corner post. For minutes I paused there, steeling myself to go on. Then I fell flat on the ground. Teeth clenched and mouth dry, I slid into the alleyway toward the two perimeter fences. I stretched my body to full length, buried my fingers in the dry soil, pulled and pushed and wriggled toward the barbed wire roll. Sweat ran into my eyes, soaked my clothes. I touched the wire roll, slid into the entanglement. Then I was at the outer fence. Taking a deep breath and a quick look at the towers, I lifted a wire cautiously, rolled under and away from the fence, through the fern thicket and into darkness. Silence. I stole through meadows and rye fields to a small village in the Nahe Valley, about 3 kilometers south of the camp. There I crept into a barn and fell asleep in a mound of hay. A sharp sound awakened me. It was the farmer harnessing his horses. I approached and told him outright that I had escaped from the camp and needed help. Amazed, he said that the only prisoners to escape thus far had accomplished the feat by signing up for the French Foreign Legion. He took me into the kitchen, where his wife and daughter fed me an enormous breakfast of eggs and fried potatoes. As I ate, he told me that he would arrange to supply me with papers for Fred and myself. After a good night's sleep in a feather bed, I awoke with new vigour and a firm resolve to get Fred out of the camp. Though the farmer disapproved of the risk, he supplied me with necessities. After nightfall, I cautiously approached the camp, carrying a sack of food for the skeleton men. While I was creeping toward the outer fence, 2 Moroccan guards spotted me. I rose to my feet, expecting to be shot on the spot. To my surprise, however, they were more interested in the contents of my bag. Speaking better French than they did, I convinced them that I was merely trying to smuggle food to a friend, and I promised them a large gift of American cigarettes if they allowed me to pass their post at will for a similar bribe each time. Greed triumphed. They accepted 2 packs of Camels and even lifted the wire for me. I found Fred asleep in the hole. Dumbfounded by my reappearance, but still unready to escape himself, he argued that he expected to receive his legitimate discharge papers by the weekend. He said that if he did not have them by Saturday night, he would make the break then. Annoyed by the failure of my risky mission, I left Fred and the food with the dying and hopeless. Another pack of American cigarettes secured my retreat from the camp. An hour later, I was back in the farmer's barn. For 2 days, I enjoyed my life on the farm. I helped the farmer in his fields, raked the hay, loaded wagons. I ate good food with an appetite long unassuaged and splashed after sundown in the tin tub in the barn. I was completely happy with my lot, for I had discovered that freedom could be won in a courageous moment. On Saturday night, I approached the camp again with more of the farmer's American cigarettes. The 2 Moroccan guards accepted the bribe and let me slip through the fences. As I approached Fred's hole, a number of shadowy figures loomed up out of the darkness. In a moment I was surrounded and overpowered. Only then did I realize that I had been seized by my own countrymen. It turned out that my name had been included in an afternoon roll call. Afterward, the commandant had announced that everyone on the list was to be shipped to France, and that 5 men would be shot for anyone who escaped. My comrades, finding themselves in a terrible dilemma, had hoped that I would come back again, into their trap. Perhaps my return had saved 5 lives, but at that moment I could not forgive the treachery of my fellow prisoners. I drew a sharp mental line between myself and my comrades of yesteryear. Before sunrise on Sunday, August 5th, Fred and I were lined up with a huge group of prisoners and marched off to a railroad siding. There stood a freight train of 42 cattle cars. We were packed on board, 100 men to each filthy car, and locked in. The train started out on a long journey to an unknown destination inside France. Suffocating heat and the stench of manure turned the cattle car into a torture chamber. As the train rolled toward the French border, I sat at the rear wall, cutting and sawing at a plank in the siding with a knife that I had managed to secrete. I worked long and furtively while all the others lay in a stupor, half dead of thirst and hunger. By midnight, I had cut out a portion of the plank, making a hole big enough to slip through. When the train came to a stop, I stuck my head through the opening, then my shoulders. Halfway to freedom, I was suddenly grabbed by my feet and dragged back into the boxcar. A dozen of my comrades fell over me like hyenas. Again, I was their captive. The trip went on in misery all that night, the next day and another night, without food or water, with men suffering from dysentery and worse. One of the skeleton men died the second night, and another died on the following morning. The stench of death and decomposition became unbearable. To get a breath of clean air, I pressed my face against the bars of the only vent and sniffed the ocean. Soon afterward, the train ground to a halt at an improvised platform in the middle of nowhere. Deployed on both sides of the track were a great many French soldiers of the regular army. They ordered us to dismount and prodded us into a well-concealed prison camp that resembled a fortified colonial outpost. I learned that we were near La Flèche, a town midway between Le Mans and Nantes. The camp swallowed us up. As soon as the enlisted men were separated from the officers, we were quartered in crude shelters and issued food tickets. At once, I began to prowl the caged-in area in search of a way out. But the camp perimeter was bristling with machine gun nests and barbed wire walls more formidable than those in Dietersheim. Besides, the young French regulars were not the kind of troops whom one could bribe. Fred and I were forced to admit we might be in for a long wait on short rations. My days dragged on in heat and hunger. I made my endless rounds through the cage, looking for an escape route. For many hours I lay in the shadows of the latrines, observing the guards' routine. At night, when the heat had lessened, I crawled along the fences, slipped out of the rotating beams of searchlights, climbed the fences into adjoining cages, all in vain. After 2 weeks in La Flèche, my cheeks were hollow and my ribs protruded. I scorned those who had given up, and even those who were carried out dead. Hunger was greater than friendship, stronger than prayers, deadlier than disease. Ruthless trading among the prisoners was as common as death. Rings, watches, clothes, and even gold teeth were bartered for food. Food rations were exchanged for the soggy butts of cigarettes. There were informers, thieves, religious and political fanatics, madmen and cowards, and a few with a flaming desire to escape. It was not until my 3rd week in camp that I hit upon an escape route. My plan was so simple that it could not fail. Every day a large detail of prisoners from the enlisted men's section went to our latrines, picked up tall metal drums filled with human waste, and, marching out under heavy guard, dumped the contents into pits outside the north end of the camp. Fred and I would join the detail unannounced, walk out of the camp with a drum, and then simply neglect to return. The following morning, our first attempt miscarried. The moment we left our cage with the column of coughing prisoners, a self-seeking Austrian prisoner recognized us as officers and alerted the guards. Fortunately, we were able to talk ourselves out of 2 months in solitary confinement. I quickly improved on the plan. The same evening, after the camp was asleep, I slipped out of the barracks and across the yard to the fence separating our cage from that of our neighbouring petty officers. I climbed the fence, jumped into the adjoining cage, and disappeared in one of the latrines. Moments later, Fred was at my side. At sunrise, the camp came alive, and 2 hours of uneasy waiting followed. Then the work crew arrived. Fred and I lifted a drum, mingled with the men, and marched out of the petty officer's cage fully unrecognised. With our hearts beating hard, we arrived at the pits, ducked behind the big drum. While the guards were nonchalantly palavering, we fell flat into the high grass and rolled and snaked away. Reaching the edge of the nearby woods, we crawled through low thickets. After 3 hours of struggle, we fell exhausted into a thicket. Later we found some berries that quenched our thirst and took the edge off our hunger. By nightfall we took a road that led eastward toward Le Mans. For hours we dragged along the pavement, jumped into the ditch along the road whenever a truck or a car passed, and took to the road again in sheer agony. Our stockings disintegrated, blisters formed on toes and heels, and the skin came right off our feet. For 3 nights we hiked along, passing French outposts and farmers on their way to town, always on the verge of being discovered, full of suspense and an unbroken will to succeed, subsisting on food that we found in farmers' gardens or scavenged from butchers' scrap heaps. During the days we slept huddled together in woods or culverts. When we finally reached Le Mans at the end of the 3rd night, we spruced up our clothes, shaved our whiskers in a park, then walked into the centre of the city with terrible hunger cramps in the stomach. We managed to find the station and discovered that the Paris Express would not come through until well after midnight. We left the city and hid for the day in a field overgrown with mignonettes. Long after dusk, we cautiously approached the railroad station from the rear, where the freight yard promised cover and a clandestine approach to the passenger platform. At 01:07, when the express clattered into the station, Fred and I hurried through the dark freight yard into a throng of passengers and onto a crowded coach. As the train left Le Mans, we joined the passengers sprawled on the floor and feigned sleep in the hope that the conductor would not bother to wake us for tickets we did not have. But when the conductor appeared at the front of the car calling "Vos billets, mesdames, messieurs," Fred climbed to his feet and headed toward the rear of the train. As expected, the conductor left us tired ones undisturbed. Then I waited for Fred to return. He never came back. It was a magnificent Saturday morning, that first day in September 1945, when the express rolled into Paris and came to a stop in the Gare de Montparnasse. I stood like an island amid the outflowing passengers, looking for Fred. There was no Fred, and the fruitless delay cost me my freedom. An attendant asked me for my ticket. As I concocted a story that my luggage had been stolen, I was suddenly confronted by 2 suspicious gendarmes who demanded to see the contents of my pockets. I fled into the streets of Paris, but my painful feet slowed me down, and after a short chase by police and civilians, I was again a captive. Unwilling to be taken for a thief, I admitted that I was an escaped prisoner of war. As a result, I was stripped and put into a windowless cell. All too soon, a corporal appeared at the police station, allowed me to put on my clothes but not my shoes, then handcuffed me and prodded me with his gun barrel into the streets of Montparnasse. We travelled through Paris by metro to the Gare du Nord, then by train through a sunny countryside to Cormeilles-en-Parisis, and finally on foot to the grim bastion named Fort Cormeilles. A new search, a new interrogation. I refused to talk to anyone but an officer. As a reward, I was flung headlong into a windowless dungeon. I groped around in the inky darkness, found a pile of straw, and fell into a death-like sleep. Later, much later, I was awakened and ordered out by 2 guards. They dragged me down a corridor that smelled like a morgue, up a staircase, and into an office. There, an Alsatian sergeant offered me a deal, a glass of water for a full confession. Wearily I agreed, but naturally the truth was not to the sergeant's liking. With great relish he described the penalty for such a pack of lies, indefinite solitary with all the privations it entailed. However, he said, there was a way out. Officers with my training were needed to serve in the French Foreign Legion, and if I volunteered, I would be a free man in 4 weeks, enjoying the food and wine of legionnaires, as well as the talented prostitutes in Sidi Bel Abbé. I told him that I was not his man. He smiled maliciously and guaranteed me plenty of time to reconsider my hasty decision. Soon the door of the dungeon closed behind me again. Perpetual night surrounded me, and hunger consumed me. Yet the darkness was comforting, for it spared me the sight of my degradation and misery, and also of the vermin which populated my cell. For long periods I drifted in a deep trance, haunted by the sergeant's advice to reconsider. I finally did reconsider, but only because there was no escaping this stone fortress. I had to be sent elsewhere to find some avenue of flight. When the guards carried me out of my cell, I gasped to the sergeant, "I'm joining up!" He put on his malicious smile and ordered a soldier to bring me food. Somewhat restored by a meal of goulash, bread and coffee, I signed my life away and was promised a quick transfer to another post to recuperate. But my departure was delayed by a desperate bout with dysentery, which put me in the fort hospital. For several days I clung to a thin thread of life, and then somehow made a sudden recovery. On September 28th, I was given back my few belongings and a shabby brown uniform of the German Labour Service, which would mark me out as a prisoner in case I escaped. A friendly corporal took me on a trip back through Paris, and thence by express to a camp near Le Mans. As a new legionnaire, I was far from free. In fact, my situation was now worse than ever. I was still in captivity, in a maximum security prison camp. In addition, as the French commandant was quick to warn me, I would be court-martialed and shot as a deserter from the Legion if I attempted to escape again. And I was also weakened by my long ordeal and the loss of about £30. On October 1st, I was released from a temporary cell into the officers' cage, which was located in the centre of the camp. Here I found some fellow prisoners from La Fèche, who had been transferred here as security risks because this camp was allegedly escape-proof. The same evening I began to explore the camp looking for a way out. Tall fences, complicated wireworks, and keen-eyed guards made my search difficult. Day after day I spent many hours studying the habits of the sentries on the machine-gun towers, the guards walking along the double fence separating our cage from the French compound. I climbed fences at night to examine the other cages and to probe for weak spots in the defence perimeter. I found no exit, and my search grew desperate as the day approached when I was to be sent away to the Legion. On October 13th, my lucky star suddenly rose again. I received a package from the International Red Cross for which I had signed while in the hospital in Fort Cormay. The contents included cheese, biscuits, concentrated foods, and, test of all, 4 packs of American cigarettes and a can of tobacco. Now I was a wealthy man, with valuable wares to trade for the civilian clothes I needed. Something still more valuable turned up 2 days later. While I was investigating the camp infirmary, a young medical student who helped treat the prisoners asked me what I had to sell. I gave him my wristwatch, which I had laboured long and hard to conceal from my various searchers. The student said that he could get 1,000 francs for the watch, and much to my surprise, he delivered the sum the next night after supper. The money was sufficient for train tickets to Germany and for food for many days. As I bargained judiciously for my going-home wardrobe, a plan of escape gradually took form. My fellow prisoners proved highly susceptible to my American cigarettes. For 6 cigarettes, I acquired a leather briefcase in which to stow my meagre possessions. A dove blue overcoat cost me 10 cigarettes, a hat and shirt only 3. My biggest expenditure was 20 cigarettes, plus my telltale uniform, for an inconspicuous blue suit belonging to a prisoner, Horst Bender, whom I trusted enough to ask for help on the night of the break. The last items I needed were a number of butcher hooks. I acquired these for 10 cigarettes from a young prisoner who worked in the shop, telling him I intended to use them to build a clothes rack. Actually, I planned to use the hooks to get through the barbed wire fences in a dimly lit area between the kitchen compound and the guardhouse. I reviewed my plan over and over again and resolved to die fighting rather than be recaptured again. I decided to make my break around 2200, just before moonrise, on October 27th. Saturday, October 27th. The morning roll call was routine. I enjoyed the thought that in another 24 hours the camp would be in uproar over my escape. I was in an altogether excellent mood, and made it a point to talk to the men I knew as a kind of farewell. I gave Horst Bender final instructions about the part he was to play that night. At supper time, I wrapped my coat around the briefcase, handed the bundle as well as my evening ration to Bender, and stationed myself near the cart which had brought food to our barracks. It was raw and cold when the work gang picked up the cart shortly after 2000. I quickly mingled with the men and helped them push the wagon out of the cage, down the camp's main street and into the kitchen compound. Under the cover of darkness, I stole away and entered the latrine, where I waited until all the after-dinner strollers had left the adjacent prison yard. Then I stepped into the dark area next to the fence that separated me from my previous cage. A shadowy figure came forward from behind a tree. Bender. He flung a bundle over the fence into my open arms. I rushed back into the latrine, took out and put on Bender's blue suit, wrapped my brown uniform, went out and threw the package over the fence to Bender. He tossed me another bundle containing my coat and briefcase, then waved a white hand in farewell. A few jumps, and I flattened myself alongside the inner fence, opposite the guard's watchhouse. I froze while a guard passed just 6 meters away, then used some of my hooks to gather several strands of barbed wire. After checking the watchhouse and the machine gun towers to the right and left, I crawled through the fence in slow motion and continued on, pushing my bundle ahead of me toward the barbed wire roll, always remaining in the shadow that an evergreen cast across the firing line. I parted the roll, hung it up with a hook on the outer fence, used 2 more hooks to make an opening in the last barrier, tossed my bundle through and followed it into the outside world. In the shadow of the guardhouse, I put on my coat and hat and stuck a cigarette in my mouth. When all the guards were out of sight, I walked into the soldiers' compound. As I entered the illuminated drill grounds, a number of soldiers crossed my path. I halted, lighted my cigarette, then continued straight ahead, through the yards, between the barracks, and finally out of the camp. Strolling into Le Mans from the outskirts, I reached the station at 23:10 and bought a second-class ticket to Paris. About 2 hours later, it was now Sunday, October 28, I boarded the express and took a corner seat in a smoky compartment. At 0700 in the morning, I arrived at the Gare de Montparnasse, nonchalantly displayed my ticket to the controller, passed by one of the gendarmes who had captured me 2 months ago, took the metro to the Gare de l'Est. After buying a ticket to Metz, I had fully 13 hours to kill before my train departed. All day I roamed through Paris in turmoil, thinking that everyone was staring at me, certain that the very next gendarme would ask to see papers I did not possess. But I managed to stay out of harm's way and returned to the station in ample time to board my train. The journey to Metz took 9 hours and brought me to the brink of exhaustion. In Metz, I purchased a ticket to the French border town of Forbach and planned my trip when darkness would again be a cover. Again, I walked out into the city streets. My head was spinning, my stomach aching. The strain was almost unbearable. I needed sleep, but did not dare to rest. I needed food, but I hesitated to enter a store without having ration tickets. Yet I also felt that I was riding a lucky streak, that nothing could stop my escape. Finally, I went into a bakery and made some excuse for having no tickets. I bought 2 crisp loaves of bread and wolfed them down as I wandered through the alleyways of the old town. But the meal left me so hungry that I boldly went into a restaurant, explained that I had lost my ration tickets, and asked to be served anyway. I had a bowl of pea soup, a big portion of Lyonnaise sausage, and potato salad. After the veritable banquet, I resumed my furtive, fearful wandering. But at dusk I was still free, and at 18:45 I returned to the station. Knowing full well that I faced an exacting border inspection at Forbach, I boarded the waiting train and worked my way forward looking for a place to hide. When I arrived at the locomotive, there were no trainmen with the cab. A quick decision, a fast move, and I buried myself in the coal pile on the tender. Moments later, the stoker and the engineer returned, the whistle sounded, and the train pulled out of the Metz station. After 2 hours, the stoker had shovelled his way dangerously close to my position. Cautiously, I crawled to the back of the tender, saw a large metal box, opened it, and removed a hose, then dived in and closed the lid. Suddenly, with brakes shrieking, the train slowed down and stopped in the Forbach station, amid a large contingent of French soldiers. The locomotive, uncoupled from the train, rolled into position to take on water. When the trainmen looked for the hose, they found me in the box instead. Speaking French, I mumbled an excuse that apparently satisfied them, that I was just going to visit some friends across the border. They ordered me off the locomotive. I hurried into the darkness of the railroad yard and hid under a boxcar. In time, the soldiers finished their inspection and withdrew. The engine moved into place, was hooked up, and the train started forward. At the last moment I raced across the tracks, caught the rear bumper of the first car, climbed its flimsy ladder and flattened myself on the roof. The train rolled on through the night. I clung to the roof, scarcely aware of the biting cold or the clouds of soot brushing my face. When I glimpsed lights ahead, I descended the ladder and waited on the bumper until the train stopped. I was in Saarbrücken. Again the platform was swarming with French troops. I hastily mingled with departing passengers and looked around for the local German railroad personnel. Spotting the station master in his blue suit, I went up to him and whispered in German, "I am German. I've escaped from a prison camp. I need help." The station master only nodded and said, "Follow me. Just act normal and pretend to be one of us." He led me out into the freight yard to an isolated railroad car. With a knock at the door, he pushed me inside, into a group of off-duty railroad men. The workers plied me with excited questions, gave me soap to wash off my layers of soot, fed me fried potatoes and ersatz coffee. They told me that my chance would come in 30 minutes, when an American express en route from Paris to Frankfurt would stop to switch engines, with a German crew to continue the journey to Frankfurt. Then they pressed a railroad lamp into my hand to make me look natural and escorted me to the platform just in time to see the express pull into the station. American military police dropped from the cars, inspected the axles for fugitives. The engines were quickly switched and the train was ready to leave. As I stood between the workers at the head of the train, everything, sight and sound, seemed to be as sharp as a knife. The panting of the locomotive, the Americans searching the cars, the French roaming the platforms, commands shouted in English, sentences spoken in French. With a great crash, the locomotive lurched forward. I pressed the hands of my two friends, leaped onto the moving engine. 10, 12 piston strokes, and the express surged into the darkness, away from the border and deeper into Germany. As the sky turned purple in the east, the train rumbled over the Mainzer Bridge across the Rhine, rolling eastward, always eastward. And when the first rays of the morning sun touched the tops of the pines in the woods south of Frankfurt, I knew that I was free. At exactly 06:40 on Tuesday, October 30th, 1945, the train came to a halt at a signal. I leapt from the cab and ran into the woods of my youth. As the sky turned purple in the east, the train rumbled over the Mainzer Bridge across the Rhine, rolling eastward, always eastward. And when the first rays of the morning sun touched the tops of the pines in the woods south of Frankfurt, I knew that I was free. At exactly 6:40 on Tuesday, October 30th, 1945, the train came to a halt at a signal. I leaped from the cab and ran into the woods of my youth.